try this again. I tried to make this video so far like twice, and yes, me keeps happening. So yes, let's get down to business to defeat the Huns. Where was I? You just arranged matters so that no one was in the way, and since everyone knew that it was impossible to do 90 miles an hour down Oxford Street, no one noticed. At least cars were better than horses. The internal combustion engine had been a windfall for Crowley. And the only horses he could be seen riding on business in the old days were big black dogs with eyes like flame and hooves that struck sparks. That was de rigueur for a demon. Usually, Crowley fell off. He wasn't much good with animals. Somewhere around Chiswick, Aziraphale scrabbled vaguely in the scree of tapes in the glove compartment. "What is a velvet underground?" he said. "You wouldn't like it," said Crowley. "Oh," said the angel dismissively, "bebop." Do you know, Aziraphale, that probably if a million human beings were asked to describe modern music, they would not use the term bebop, said Crowley. "Oh, this is more like it, Tchaikovsky," said Aziraphale. I do love Tchaikovsky, to be honest. Opening a case and slotting its cassette into the bla punct. "You won't enjoy it," said Crowley. "It's been in the car for more than a fortnight." A heavy bass beat began to thump through the Bentley as they sped past Heathrow. Aziraphale's brow furrowed. "I don't recognize this," he said. "What is it?" "It's Tchaikovsky's Another One Bites the Dust," said Crowley, closing his eyes as they went through the slow. To while away the time, they crossed the sleeping Chilterns. They also listened to William Byrd's We Are the Champions and Beethoven's I Want to Break Free. Neither were as good as Vaughan Williams' Fat Bottom Girls. It is said that the devil has all the best tunes. This is broadly true, but heaven has the best choreographers. Goes hand in hand. The Oxfordshire plain stretched out to the west, with a scattering of lights to mark the slumbering villages, where honest yeomen were settling down to sleep after a long day's editorial direction, financial consulting, or software engineering. Up here on the hill, a few glowworms were lighting up. The surveyor's theodolite is one of the more direful symbols of the 20th century. Set up anywhere in an open countryside, it says, "There will come road widening, yea, and 2,000 home estates, in keeping with the essential character of the village. Executive developments will be manifest." But not even the most conscientious surveyor surveys at midnight. And yet here the thing was, tripod legs deep in the turf. Not many theodolites have had a hazel twig strapped to the top either, or crystal pendulums hanging from them, and Celtic runes carved into the legs. The soft breeze flapped the cloak of the slim figure who was adjusting the knobs of the thing. It was quite a heavy cloak, sensibly waterproof, with a warm lining. Most books on witchcraft will tell you that witches work naked. This is because most books on witchcraft are written by men. The young woman's name was Anathema Device. She was not astonishingly beautiful. All her features, considered individually, were extremely pretty, but the entirety of her face gave the impression that it had been put together hurriedly, from stock without reference to any plan. Probably the most suitable word is attractive, although people who knew what it meant and could spell it might add vivacious. Um, Although there's something very 50s about vivacious, so perhaps they wouldn't. Young women should not go alone on dark nights, even in Oxfordshire. But any prowling maniac would have had more than his work cut out if he had accosted Anathema Device. She was a witch, after all. And precisely because she was a witch, and therefore sensible, she put a little faith in protective amulets and spells. She saved it all for a foot-long bread knife, which she kept in her belt. She sighted through the glass and made another adjustment. She muttered under her breath. Surveyors often muttered under their breath. They muttered things like, soon have a relief road through here, faster than you can say Jack Robinson, or that's 3.5 meters, give or take a gnat's whisker. This was an entirely different kind of muttering. Darksome night and shining moon, muttered Anathema. East by south, by west by southwest, west southwest. Got you. She picked up a folded ordnance survey map and held it in the torchlight. Then she produced a transparent ruler and a pencil and carefully drew a line across the map. It intersected another pencil line. She smiled, not because anything was particularly amusing, but because a tricky job had been done well. Then she collapsed the strange theodolite, strapped it onto the back of a sit-up and bag black bicycle, leaning against the hedge. Made sure the book was in the basket. I know how to read, kinda, okay? And wheeled everything out to the misty lane. It was a very ancient bike with a frame apparently made of drain pipes. It had been built long before the invention of the 3-speed gear, and possibly only just after the invention of the wheel. But it was nearly all downhill to the village. Hair streaming in the wind, cloak ballooning behind her like a sheet anchor, she let the 2-wheeled juggernaut accelerate ponderously through the warm air. At least there wasn't any traffic at this time of night. The Bentley's engine went pink as it cooled. Crowley's temper, on the other hand, was heating up. You said you saw it signposted, he said. Well, we flashed by it so quickly anyway. I thought you'd been here before. 11 years ago. Crowley hurled the map onto the back seat and started the engine again. Perhaps we should ask someone, said Aziraphale. Oh yes, said Crowley. We'll stop and ask the first person we see walking along a track in the middle of the night, shall we? He jerked the car into gear and roared out into the beach-hung lane. There's something odd about this area, said Aziraphale. Can't you feel it? What? Slow down a minute. The Bentley slowed again. Odd, muttered the angel. I keep getting these flashes of... He raised his hands to his temple. What? What? Said Crowley. Aziraphale stared at him. Love, he said. Someone really loves this place. Pardon? There seems to be this great sense of love. I can't put it any better than that, especially not to you. Do you mean like... Crowley began. There was a whir, a scream, and a clunk. The car stopped. Aziraphale blinked, lowered his hands, and gingerly opened the door. You've hit someone, he said. No, I haven't, said Crowley. Someone's hit me. They got out. Behind the Bentley, a bicycle lay in the road, its front wheel bent into a creditable Mobius shape, its back wheel clicking ominously to a standstill. Let there be light, said Aziraphale. A pale blue glow filled the lane. From the ditch beside them, someone said, How the hell did you do that? The light vanished. Do what? Said Aziraphale guiltily. Now the voice sounded muzzy. I think I hit my head on something. Crowley glared at a long metallic streak on the Bentley's glossy paintwork and a dimple in the bumper. The dimple popped back into shape. The paint healed. "Up you get, young lady," said the angel, hauling Anathema out of the bracken. "No bones broken?" It was a statement, not a hope. There had been a minor fracture, but Aziraphale couldn't resist an opportunity to do good. Relatable. "You didn't have any light," she began. "Nor did you," said Crowley guiltily. "Fair's fair." "Doing a spot of astronomy, were we?" said Aziraphale, setting the bike upright. Various things clattered out of its front basket. He pointed to the battered theodolite. "No," said Anathema. "I mean, yes, and look at what you've done to poor old Phaeton." "I'm sorry," said Aziraphale. "My bicycle. It's bent to wall and amazingly resilient, these old machines," said the angel brightly, handing it to her. The front wheel gleamed in the moonlight, as perfectly round as one of the circles of hell. And she stared at it. "Well, since that's all sorted out," said Crowley, "perhaps it'd be best if we all just got on our, You wouldn't happen to know the way to the lower Tatfield, would you?" Anathema was still staring at her bicycle. She was almost certain that it hadn't had a little saddlebag with a puncture repair kit when she set out. "It's just down the hill," she said. "This is my bike, isn't it?" "Oh, certainly," said Aziraphale, wondering if he'd overdone things. "Oh, I'm sure Phaeton never had a pump." The angel looked guiltily again. "But there's place for one," he said helplessly. "2 little hooks, just down the hill, you said?" said Crowley, nudging the angel. "I think perhaps I must have knocked my head," said the girl. "We'd offer to give you a lift, of course," Crowley said quickly. "But there's nowhere for the bike." "Except for the luggage rack," said Aziraphale. "The Bentley hasn't..." The angel scrambled the spilled contents of the bike's basket onto the back seat and helped the stunned girl in after them. "One does not," said Crowley he said to Crowley, "pass by on the other side." "Yours might not. This one does." "We have got other things to do, you know." Crowley glared at the new luggage rack. It had tartan straps. The bicycle lifted itself up and tied itself firmly in place. Then Crowley got in. "Where do you live, my dear?" Aziraphale oozed. My bike didn't have lights either." "Well, it did, but they're they're the sort you put those old double batteries in, and they went moldy and I took them off," said Anathema. She glared at Crowley. "I have a bread knife, you know," she said, "somewhere." Aziraphale looked shocked at the implication. "Madam, I assure you..." Crowley switched on the lights. He didn't need them to see by, but they made the other humans on the road less nervous. Then he put the car into gear and drove sedately down the hill. The road came out from under the trees and after a few hundred yards reached the outskirts of a middle-sized village. It had a familiar feel to it. It had been 11 years, but this place definitely rang a distant bell. "Is there a hospital around here?" he said. "Run by nuns?" Anathema shrugged. "Don't think so," she said. "The only large place is Tadfield Manor. I don't know what goes on there." "Divine planning," muttered Crowley under his breath. "And gears," said Anathema. "My bike did not have gears. I'm sure my bike didn't have gears." Crowley leaned across to the angel. "Oh, Lord, heal this bike," he whispered sarcastically. "I'm sorry. I just got carried away," hissed Aziraphale. "Tartan straps? Tartan is stylish." Crowley growled. On those occasions when the angel managed to get his mind into the 20th century, it always gravitated to 1950. "You can drop me off here," said Anathema from the back seat. "Our pleasure," beamed the angel. As soon as the car had stopped, he had the back door open and was bowing like an aged retainer welcoming the young massa back to the old plantation. Anathema gathered her things together and stepped out as haughtily as possible. She was quite sure neither of the two men had gone around to the back of the car, but the bike was unstrapped and leaning against the gate. There was definitely something very weird about them, she decided. Aziraphale bowed again. So glad to have been of assistance, he said. Thank you, said Anathema icily. Can we get on? Said Crowley. Good night, miss. Get in, Angel. Oh, well, that explained it. She had been perfectly safe after all. She watched the car disappear toward the center of the village and wheeled the bike up the path to the cottage. She hadn't bothered to lock it. She was sure that Agnes would have mentioned it if she was going to be burgled, so she was always very good at personal things like that. She'd rented the cottage furnished, which meant that the actual furniture was the special sort. You find in these circumstances, and had probably been left out for the dustman by the local War on Want shop. It didn't matter. She didn't expect to be here long. If Agnes was right, she wouldn't be anywhere long, nor would anybody else. She spread her maps and things out on the ancient table under the kitchen solitary light bulb. What had she learned? Nothing much, she decided. Probably it was at the north end of the village. But she'd suspected that anyway. If you got too close, the signal swamped you. If you were too far away, you couldn't get an accurate fix. It was infuriating. The answer must be in the book somewhere. The trouble was that in order to understand the predictions, you had to be able to think like a half-crazed, highly intelligent 17th century witch with a mind like a crossword puzzle dictionary. Other members of the family had said that Agnes made things obscure to conceal them from the understanding of outsiders. Anathema, who suspected she could occasionally think like Agnes, had privately decided that it was because Agnes was a bloody-minded old bitch with a mean sense of humor. She didn't have the book. Anathema stared in horror at the things on the table, the maps, the homemade divinatory theodolite, the thermos that had contained hot bravo, the torch, the rectangle of empty air where the prophecy should have been. She'd lost it, but that was ridiculous. One of the things Agnes was always very specific about was what happened to the book. She snatched up the torch and ran from the house. A feeling like the opposite of the feeling where you're having, back to Aziraphale talking. A feeling like the opposite of the feeling you're having when you say things like, this feels spooky, said Aziraphale. That's what I mean. I never say things like, this feels spooky, said Crowley. I'm all for spooky. A cherished feel, said Aziraphale desperately. Nope, can't sense a thing, said Crowley with forced jolliness. You're just oversensitive. It's my job, said Aziraphale. Angels can't be oversensitive. I expect people around here, like living here, and you're just picking it up. Never picked up anything like this in London, said Aziraphale. There you are then, proves my point, said Crowley, and this is the place. I remember the stone lions on the gatepost. The Bentley's headlights lit up the groves of the overgrown rhododendrons. Now lined the drive. The tires scrunched over the gravel. It's a bit early in the morning to be calling on nuns, said Aziraphale doubtfully. Nonsense. Nuns are up and about at all hours, said Crowley. It's probably complying. Unless that's a slimming aid. Oh, cheap. Very cheap, said the angel. There's really no need for that sort of thing. Don't get defensive. I told you these were some of ours, black nuns. We needed a hospital close to the airbase, you see. You lost me there. You don't think American diplomats' wives usually give birth in little religious hospitals in the middle of nowhere, do you? It all had to seem to happen naturally. There's an air base at Lower Tadfield. She went there for the opening. Things started to happen. Base hospital not ready. Our man there said, "There's a place just down the road," and there we were. Rather good organization, except for one or two minor details, said Aziraphale smugly. But it nearly worked, snapped Crowley, feeling he should stick up for the old firm. You see, evil always contains the seeds of its own destruction, said the angel. It is ultimately negative, and therefore encompasses its downfall, even at its moments of apparent triumph. No matter how grandiose or how well planned out, how apparently foolproof an evil plan, the inherent sinfulness will, by definition, rebound upon its instigators, no matter how apparently successful it may seem upon the way. At the end, it will wreck itself. It will founder upon the rocks of iniquity and sink headfirst to vanish without a trace into the seas of oblivion. Alright, I'm going to pause right here because my allergies. I need to go blow my nose. I'll be right back. Alright, I'm back. So, Crowley considered this. No, he had said, at last, for my money, it was just average incompetence. Hey, he whistled under his breath. The gravelled forecourt in the front of the manor was crowded with cars, and they weren't none cars. The Bentley was, if anything, outclassed. A lot of the cars had GT or turbo in their names, and phone aerials on their roofs. They were nearly all less than a year old. Very nice. Crowley's hand itched. Aziraphale healed bicycles and broken bones. He longed to steal a few radios, let alone some tires, that sort of thing. He resisted it. Well, he said, in my day, nuns were packed 4 to a Moorish traveler. This can't be right, said Aziraphale. Perhaps they've gone private, said Crowley. Or you've got the wrong place. It's the right place, I tell you. Come on. They got out of the car. 30 seconds later, someone shot both of them with incredible accuracy. If there was one thing that Mary Hodges, former loquacious, was good at, it was attempting to obey orders. She liked orders. They made the world a simpler place. And what she wasn't good at was change. She'd really liked the chattering order. She'd made friends for the first time. She'd had a room of her own for the first time. Of course, she knew that it was engaged in things which might, from certain viewpoints, be considered bad, but Mary Hodges had seen quite a lot of life in 30 years and had no illusions about what most of the human race had to do in order to make it from one week to the next. Besides the food was good, and you got to meet interesting people. The orders, such as was left of it, had moved after the fire. After all, their sole purpose in existing had been fulfilled. They went their separate ways. She hadn't gone. She rather liked the manor, and she said someone ought to stay and see it was properly repaired. Because you couldn't trust workmen these days unless you were on top of them the whole time, in a manner of speaking. This meant breaking her vows, but Mother Superior said this was all right. Nothing to worry about. Breaking vows was perfectly okay in a black sisterhood. And it would all be the same in 100 years' time, or rather 11 years' time. So if it gave her any pleasure, here were the deeds and an address to forward any mail unless it came in long brown envelopes with windows in the front. Then something very strange had happened to her. Left alone in the rambling building, working from one of the few undamaged rooms, arguing with men with cigarette stubs behind their ears and plaster dust on their trousers, and the kind of pocket calculator that comes up with a different answer if the sums involved are used in notes. She discovered something she never knew existed. She discovered underlayers of silliness and eagerness to please. Mary Hodges found it. Sorry, I have like a frog in my throat. I'm not trying to be all. It's just happening, okay? She discovered under layers of silliness and eagerness to please, Mary Hodges. She found it quite easy to interpret builders' estimates and do VAT calculations. She got some books from the library and found finance to be both interesting and uncomplicated. She'd stopped reading the kind of women's magazines that talk about romance and knitting and started reading the kind of women's magazines that talk about orgasms. But apart from making a mental note to have one if ever the occasion presented itself, she dismissed them as only romance and knitting in a new form. So she'd started reading the kind of magazine that talked about mergers. After much thought, she bought a small home computer from an amused and condescending young dealer in Norton. After a crowded weekend, she took it back. Not as he thought when she walked back into the shop to have a plug put on it, but because it didn't have a 387 coprocessor, that bit he understood he was a dealer after all, and couldn't quite understand long words. But after that conversation rapidly went downhill, from his point of view, Mary Hodges produced yet more magazines. Most of them had the terms PC somewhere in their title, and many of them had articles and reviews that she had circled carefully in red ink. She read about new women. She hadn't ever realized that she'd been an old woman, but after some thought, she'd decided that titles like that were all one with the romance and the knitting and the orgasms, and the really important thing to be was yourself, just as hard as you could. She'd always been inclined to dress in black and white. All she needed to do was raise the hemlines, raise the heels, and leave off the wimple. It was while leafing through a magazine one day that she learned that around the country there were apparently insatiable demand for commodious buildings and spacious grounds run by people who understood the needs of business community. The following day, she went out and ordered some stationery in the name of the Tadfield Manor Conference and Management Training Center, reasoning that by the time it had been printed, she'd know all that was necessary to know about running such places. The ads went out the following week. It had turned out to be an overwhelming success because Mary Hodges realized early in her new career as herself that management training didn't have to mean sitting people down in front of unreliable slide projectors. Firms expected far more than that these days. She provided it. Crowley sank down with his back against a statue. Aziraphale had already toppled backwards into a rhododendron bush, a dark stain spreading across his coat. Crowley felt dampness suffusing his own shirt. This was ridiculous. The last thing he needed now was to be killed. It would require all sorts of explanations. They didn't hand out new bodies just like that. They always wanted to know what you'd done with the old one. It was like trying to get a new pen from a particularly bloody-minded stationery department. He looked at his hand in disbelief. Demons have to be able to see in the dark, and he could see that his hand was yellow. He was bleeding yellow. Gingerly, he tasted a finger. Then he crawled over to Aziraphale and checked the angel's shirt. If the stain on it was blood, something had gone very wrong with biology. Oh, that stung, moaned the fallen angel. Got me right under the ribs. Yes, but do you normally bleed blue? Said Crowley. Aziraphale's eyes opened. His right hand patted his chest. He sat up. He went through the same crude forensic self-examination as Crowley. Paint? He said. Crowley nodded. What are they playing at? Said Aziraphale. I don't know, said Crowley, but I think it's called Silly Buggers. His tone suggested that he could play too, and do it better. It was a game. It was tremendous fun. Nigel Tompkins, assistant head purchasing, squirmed through the undergrowth, his mind aflame with some of the more memorable scenes of some of the better Clint Eastwood movies. And to think he'd believed that management training was going to be boring too. There had been a lecture, but it had been about the paint guns, and all the things you should never do with them. And Tompkins had looked at the fresh young faces of his rival trainees as to a man. They resolved to do them all as if there was half a chance of getting away with it. People told you business was a jungle and then put a gun in your hand. Then it was pretty obvious to Tompkins that they weren't expecting you to simply aim for the shirt. What it was all about was the corporate head hanging over your fireplace. Anyway, it was rumored that someone over in United Consolidated had done his promotion prospects a considerable amount of good by the anonymous application of high-speed earful of paint to an immediate superior, causing the letter to complain of little ringing noises in important meetings and eventually to be replaced on medical grounds. And there were his fellow trainees, fellow sperms, to switch metaphors, all struggling forward in the knowledge that there could only ever be one chairman of Industry Holdings, PLC, and that the job would probably go to the biggest prick. Of course, some girl with a clipboard from personnel had told them that the courses they were going on were just to establish leadership potential, group cooperation, initiative, and so on. The trainees had tried to avoid one another's spaces. It had worked quite well so far. The whitewater canoeing had taken care of Johnstone, punctured eardrum, and the mountain climbing in Wales had done for Whittaker, groin stain. Tompkins thumbed another paint pellet into the gun and muttered business mantras to himself. Do unto others before they do unto you. Kill or be killed. Either shit or get out of the kitchen. Survival of the fittest. Make my day. I like some of those. He crawled a little nearer to the figures by the statue. They didn't seem to have noticed him. When the available cover ran out, he took a deep breath and leapt to his feet. Okay, douchebags, grab some where one of the figures had been there was something dreadful. He blacked out. Crowley restored himself to his favorite shape. I hate having to do that, he murmured. I'm always afraid I'll forget how to change back, and it can ruin a good suit. I think the maggots were a bit over the top myself, said Aziraphale, but without much rancor. The angels had a certain moral standard to maintain, so unlike Crowley, he preferred to buy his clothes rather than to wish them into being from a raw firmament, and the shirt had been quite expensive. I mean, just look at it, he said. I'll never get the stain out. Miracle it away, said Crowley, scanning the undergrowth for any more management trainees. Yes, but always know the stain was there. Deep down, I mean, said the angel. He picked up the gun and turned it over in his hands. I've never seen one of these before, he said. There was a pinging noise, and the statue beside them lost an ear. Let's not hang around, said Crowley. He wasn't alone. This is a very odd gun, very strange. I thought your side disapproved of guns, said Crowley. He took the gun from the angel's plump hand and sighted along the stubby barrel. Current thinking favors them, said Aziraphale. They lend weight to moral argument. In the right hands, of course. Yeah? Crowley snaked a hand over the metal. That's all right, then. Come on. He dropped the gun onto the recumbent form of Tompkins and marched away across the damp lawn. The front doors of the manor was unlocked. The pair of them walked through unheeded. Some plump men in army fatigues, spattered with paint, were drinking cocoa out of mugs in what had once been the sisters' refectory, and one or two of them gave them a cheery wave. Something like a hotel reception desk now occupied one end of the hall. It had a quietly confident look as Aziraphale gazed at the board on an aluminum easel behind it. In little plastic letters let into the black fabric of the board were the words August 20th through 21st, the United Holdings PLC Initiative Combat Course. Meanwhile, Crowley had picked up a pamphlet from the desk. It showed glossy pictures of the manor, with specific references to its jacuzzis and indoor heated swimming pool, and on the back was a sort of map that the conference centers always have, which makes use of careful misscaling to the nation while carefully leaving out the labyrinth of country lanes that in fact surrounds it for miles on every side. Wrong place, said Aziraphale. No, wrong time then. Yes. Crowley leafed through the booklet in the hope of any clue. Perhaps it was too much to hope that the chattering order would still be here. After all, they'd done their bit. He hissed softly. Probably they'd gone to darkest America or somewhere to convert the Christians, but he read on anyway. Sometimes this sort of leaflet had a little historical bit because the kind of companies that hired places like this for a weekend of interactive personnel analysis or a conference on the strategic marketing dynamic liked to feel that they were strategically interacting in the very building, or give or take a couple of complete rebuildings, a civil war, and two major fires that some Elizabethan fancier had endowed as a plague hospital. Not that he was actually expecting a sentence, like until 11 years ago the manor was used as a convent by an order of satanic nuns who weren't in fact all that good at it really, but you never know. A plump man wearing desert camouflage and holding a polystyrene cup of coffee wandered up to them. Who's winning? He said chummily. Young Evanson of forward planning caught me a right zinger on the elbow, We're all going to lose, said Crowley absently. There was a burst of firing from the grounds, not the snap and zing of pellets, but the full-throated crackle of aerodynamically shaped bits of lead traveling extremely fast. There was an answering stutter. The redundant warriors stared one on another. A further burst out. I'm being dyslexic again, guys. I'll try to slow down. Okay. A further burst took out a rather ugly Victorian stained glass window beside the door and stitched a row of holes in the plaster by Crowley's head. Aziraphale grabbed his arm. What the hell is it? he said. Crowley smiled like a snake. Nigel Tompkins had come to with a mild headache and a vaguely empty space in his recent memory. He was not to know that the human brain, when faced with a sight too terrible to contemplate, is remarkably good at scabbing it over with a forceful forgetfulness. So he put it down to a pellet strike on the head. He was vaguely aware that his gun was somewhat heavier, but in his mildly bemused state, he did not realize why until some time after he'd pointed it at training manager Norman Weatherd from internal audit and pulled the trigger. "I don't see why you're so shocked," said Crowley. "He wanted a real gun. Every desire in his head was for a real gun. But you've turned him loose on all those unprotected people," said Aziraphale. "Oh no," said Crowley. "Not exactly. Fair's fair." The contingent from financial planning were lying flat on their faces in what had once been the ha-ha, although they weren't very amused. "I always said you couldn't trust those people from purchasing," said the deputy financial manager. "The bastards." A shot pinged off the wall above him. He crawled hurriedly over to the little group clustered around the fallen Weatherd. "How does it look?" he said. The assistant head of wages turned a haggard face toward him. "Pretty bad," he said. "The bullet went through nearly all of them. Access, Barclay, card, diners, the lot. It was only the American Express Gold that stopped it," said Weatherd. They looked in mute horror at the spectacle of a credit card wallet with a bullet hole nearly all the way through it. "Why'd they do it?" said a wages officer. And the head of internal audit opened his mouth to say something reasonable and didn't. Everyone had a point where they crack, and his had just been hit with a spoon. 20 years in the job, he'd wanted to be a graphic designer, but the careers master hadn't heard of that. 20 years of double checking, form BF18, 20 years of cranking the bloody hand calculator, and even when the people in forward planning had computers, and now for reasons unknown, but possibly to do with reorganization and a desire to do away with all the expense of early retirement, they were shooting at him with bullets. The armies of paranoia marched behind his eyes. He looked down at his own gun, although the mists of rage and bewilderment, he saw that it was bigger and blacker than it had been when it was issued to him. It felt heavier too. He aimed it at a bush nearby and watched streams of bullets blow the bush into oblivion. Oh, so that was their game. Well, someone had to win. He looked at his men. "Okay, guys, let's get the bastards." "The way I see it," said Crowley, "no one has to pull the trigger." He gave Aziraphale a bright and brittle grin. "Come on," he said. "Let's have a look around while everyone's busy." Bullets streaked across the night. Jonathan Parker, purchasing section, was wriggling through the bushes when one of them put an arm around his neck. Nigel Tompkins spat a cluster of rhododendron leaves out of his mouth. "Down there, it's company law," he hissed through mud-encrusted features. "But up here, it's me." "That was a pretty low trick," said Aziraphale, as they strolled along the empty corridors. "What'd I do? What'd I do?" said Crowley, pushing open doors at random. "There are people out there shooting one another." "Well, that's just it, isn't it? They're doing it themselves. It's what they really want to do. I just assisted them. Think of it as a microcosm of the universe. Free will for everyone. Ineffable, right?" Aziraphale glared. "Oh, all right," said Crowley wretchedly. "No one's actually going to get killed. They're all going to have miraculous escapes. It wouldn't be any fun otherwise." Aziraphale relaxed. "You know, Crowley," he said, beaming, "I've always said that deep down inside you're really quite, All right, Crowley snapped. "Tell the whole blessed world, why don't you?" After a while, loose alliances began to emerge. Most of the financial departments found they had interests in common, settled settled their differences, and ganged up on forward planning. When the first police car arrived, 16 bullets from a variety of directions had hit it in the radiator before it had got halfway up the drive. Two more took out its radio aerial, but they were too late. Too late. Mary Hodges was just putting down the phone when Crowley opened her office door. It must be terrorists, she snaps, or poachers. She peered at them. You are the police, aren't you? She said. Crowley saw her eyes begin to widen. Like all demons, he had a good memory for faces, even after 11 years, the loss of a wimple, and the addition of some rather severe makeup. He snapped his fingers. She settled back in her chair, her face becoming a blank and amiable mask. There was no need for that, said Aziraphale. Good. Crowley glanced at his watch. Morning, ma'am, he said in a sing-song voice. We're just a couple of supernatural entities, and we were just wondering if you might help us with the whereabouts of the notorious son of Satan. He smiled coldly at the angel. I'll wake her up again, shall I? And you can say it. Well, since you put it like that, said the angel slowly, sometimes the old ways are best, said Crowley. He turned to the impassive woman. Were you a nun here 11 years ago? He said. He asked. Correction. He asked. He did not say. But whatever. Yes, said Mary. There, said Crowley to Aziraphale. See? I knew I wasn't wrong. Luck of the devil, muttered the angel. Your name was Sister Talkative or something. Loquacious, said Mary Hodges in a hollow voice. And do you recall an incident involving the switching of newborn babies, said Crowley. Asked Crowley. Sorry, I'm going to be a little bit of a grammar Nazi now. I might not be able to read. I might be dyslexic, but I know grammar. Alright. Mary Hodges hesitated. And when she did speak, it was as though memories that had been scabbed over were being disturbed for the first time in years. Yes, she said. Is there any possibility that the switch could have gone wrong in some way? I do not know. Crowley thought for a bit. You must have had records, he said. There are always records. Everyone has records these days. He glanced proudly at Aziraphale. It was one of my better ideas. Oh, yes, said Mary Hodges. And where are they? Said Aziraphale sweetly. There was a fire just after the birth. Crowley groaned and threw his hands in the air. It was Hastur, probably, he said. It's his style. Can you believe those guys? I bet he thought he was really being clever. Do you recall any details about the other children, or the other child? Asked Aziraphale. I'm correcting it now. I'm not saying said Aziraphale. Yes, please. Yes, please tell me. He had lovely little tootsie wozies. Oh, and he was very sweet, said Mary Hodges wistfully. There was the sound of a siren outside, abruptly broken off as a bullet hit it. Aziraphale nudged Crowley. Get a move on, he said. We're going to be knee-deep in police at any moment, and I will, of course, be morally obliged to assist them in their inquiries. He thought for a moment. Perhaps she can remember if there were any other women giving birth that night, and there was a sound of running feet downstairs. Stop them, said Crowley. We need more time. Any more miracles and we'll really start getting noticed by up there, said Aziraphale. If you really want Gabriel or someone wondering why 40 policemen have gone to sleep. Okay, said Crowley. That's it. It was worth a try. Let's get out of here. In 30 seconds, you will wake up, said Aziraphale to the entranced ex-nun. And you will have had a lovely dream about whether. Hold on a sec. Okay, I'm back. Doop. Where was I? had a lovely dream about whether or whatever you like best. And yes, fine, said Crowley. Now can we go? No one noticed them leaving. The police were too busy herding in 40 adrenaline-drunk fighting management trainees. 3 police vans had gouged tracks in the lawn, and Aziraphale made Crowley back up for the first of the ambulances. But then the Bentleys swished into the night. Behind them, the summer house and gazebo were already ablaze. We've really left that poor woman in a dreadful situation, said the angel. You think? Said Crowley, trying to hit a hedgehog and missing. Bookings will double. You mark my words. If she plays her cards right, sorts out the waivers, ties up all the legal bits, initiative training with real guns, they'll form queues. Why are you always so cynical? I said because it's my job. They drove in silence for a while. Then Aziraphale said, You'd think he'd show up, wouldn't you? You'd think we could detect him in some way. He won't show up, not to us. Protective camouflage. He won't even know it, but his powers will keep him hidden from prying occult forces. Occult forces? You and me, explained Crowley. I'm not occult, said Aziraphale. Angels aren't occult. We're ethereal. Whatever, snapped Crowley, too worried to argue. Is there some other way of locating him? Crowley shrugged. Should search me, he said. How much experience do you think I've got in these matters? Armageddon only happens once, you know. They don't let you go around again until you get it right. The angels stared out at the rushing hedgerows. It all seems so peaceful, he said. How do you think it will happen? Well, thermonuclear extinction has always been very popular, although I must say the big boys are being quite polite to each other at the moment. Asteroid strike? Said Aziraphale. Asked Aziraphale. Quite the fashion these days, I understand. Strike into the Indian Ocean. Great big cloud of dust and vapor. Goodbye, all higher life forms. Wow, said Crowley, taking care to exceed the speed limit. Every little bit helped. Doesn't bear thinking about it, does it? Said Aziraphale gloomily. All the higher life forms scythed away, just like that. Terrible. Nothing but dust and fundamentalists. That was nasty. Sorry, couldn't resist it. They stared at the road. Maybe some terrorist? Aziraphale began. Not one of ours, said Crowley. Ours? Said Aziraphale, although ours are freedom fighters, of course. I'll tell you what, said Crowley, scorching rubber on the Tadfield bypass. Cards on the table time. I'll tell you ours if you tell me yours. All right, you first. No, you first. But you're a demon. Yes, but a demon of my word, I should hope. Aziraphale named 5 political leaders. Crowley named 6. 3 names appeared on both lists. See, said Crowley, it's just like I've always said. They're cunning buggers, humans. You can't trust them an inch. But I don't think any of ours have any big plans afoot, said Aziraphale. Just minor acts of terror, political protests, he corrected. Said Crowley bitterly. You mean none of this cheap mass-produced murder, just personal service, every bullet individually fired by a skilled craftsman? Aziraphale didn't rise to it. What are we going to do now? Try and get some sleep. You don't sleep. I don't sleep. Evil never sleeps, and virtue is ever vigilant. Evil, in general, maybe. This specific part of it has got into the habit of getting its head down occasionally. He stared into the headlights. The time would soon come when sleep would be right out of the question. When those below found out that he personally had lost the Antichrist, they'd probably dig out all those reports he'd done on the Spanish Inquisition and try them out on him. One at a time, and then all together. He rummaged in the glove compartment, fumbled a tape at random and slotted it into the player. Little music would Beelzebub, as a devil put aside for. Oh wait, it's Queen. It's the lyrics. Beelzebub, as a devil put aside for me. I can't sing right now. I'm all bleh. I'm extra raspy. For me, murdered Crowley. His expression went blank for a moment. Then he gave a strangled scream and wrenched the on-off nub. Of course, we might be able to get a human to find him, said Aziraphale thoughtfully. What? Said Crowley distractedly. Humans are good at finding other humans. They've been doing it for thousands of years. And the child is human. As well as, he would be hidden from us, but other humans might be able to sense him, perhaps, or spot things we wouldn't think of. It wouldn't work. He's an Antichrist. He's got this sort of automatic defense, hasn't he? Even if he doesn't know it, it won't let people suspect him. Not yet. Not till it's ready. Suspicion will slide off him like whatever it is water slides off. He finished lamely. Got any better ideas? Got one single better idea? Asked Aziraphale. No. Right then, it could work. Don't tell me you haven't got any front organizations you could use. I know I have. We could see if they can pick up the trail. What could they do that we couldn't do? Well, for a start, they wouldn't get people to shoot one another. They wouldn't hypnotize respectable women. Okay, but it hasn't got a snowball's chance in hell, believe me. I know, but I can't think of anything better. Crowley turned onto the motorway and headed for London. I have a certain network of agents, said Aziraphale after a while, spread across the country, a discipline force. I could set them searching. I have something similar, Crowley admitted. You know how it is. You never know when they might come in handy. We'd better alert them. Do you think they ought to work together? Crowley shook his head. I don't think that would be a good idea, he said. They're not very sophisticated, politically speaking. Then we'll each contact our own people and see what they can manage. Got to be worth a try, I suppose, said Crowley. It's not as if I haven't got lots of other work to do, God knows. His forehead creased for a moment, and then he slapped the steering wheel triumphantly. Ducks! He shouted. What? That's what water slides off. Aziraphale took a deep breath. Just drive the car, please, he said wearily. They drove back through the dawn, while the cassette player played J.S. Bach's Mass in B minor, vocals by F. Mercury. Crowley liked the city in the early morning. Its population consisted almost entirely of people who had proper jobs to do, and real reasons for being there, as opposed to the unnecessary millions who trailed in after 8 a.m., and the streets were more or less quiet. There were double yellow no parking lines in the narrow road outside Aziraphale's bookshop, but they obediently rolled back on themselves when the Bentley pulled into the curb. Well, okay, he said, as Aziraphale got his coat from the back seat. We'll keep in touch, okay? What's this? Said Aziraphale, holding up a brown oblong. Crowley squinted at it. A book, he said. Not mine. Aziraphale turned a few of the yellowed pages. Tiny bibliophilic bells rang in the back of his mind. It must have belonged to that young girl, he said slowly. We ought to have got her address. Look, I'm in enough trouble as it is. I don't want it to get about that I go around returning people's property to them, said Crowley. Aziraphale reached the title page. It was probably a good job Crowley couldn't see his expression. I suppose you could always send it to the post office there, said Crowley, if you really feel like you must. Address it to the mad woman with the bicycle. Never trust a woman who gives funny names to means of transport. That's funny. I named mine a Nimbus 3000, so oops. Called out by a book just then. Anyway, never trust a woman who gives funny names to means of transport. Yes, yes, certainly, said the angel. He fumbled for his keys, dropped them on the pavement, picked them up, dropped them again, and hurried to the shop door. We'll be in touch then, shall we? Crowley called after them. Aziraphale paused in the act of turning the key. What? He said. Oh, yes, fine, jolly good. And he slammed the door. Right, mumbled Crowley, suddenly feeling very alone. Torchlight flickered in the lanes. The trouble with trying to find a brown-covered book among brown leaves and brown water at the bottom of a ditch of a brown earth in the brown well, grayish light of dawn, that you couldn't. It wasn't there. Anathema tried every method of search she could think of. There was the methodical quartering of the ground. There was the slapdash poking at the bracken by the roadside. And there was the nonchalant sidling up to it and looking out of the side of her eye. She even tried the one which every romantic nerve in her body insisted should work, which consisted of theatrically giving up, sitting down, and letting her glance fall naturally on a patch of earth, which, if she had been in any decent narrative, should have contained the book, but it didn't. Which meant that she had feared all along that it was probably in the back of a car belonging to two consenting cycle repairmen. She could feel generations of Agnes Netter's descendants laughing at her. Even if those two were honest enough to want to return it, they'd hardly go to all the trouble finding a cottage they'd barely seen in the dark. The only hope was that they wouldn't know what it was that they got. Aziraphale, like many Soho merchants who specialized in hard-to-find books for the discerning connoisseur, had a back room, but what was in there was far more esoteric than anything normally found inside a shrink-wrapped bag for the customer who knows what he wants. He was particularly proud of his books of prophecy, first editions usually, and everyone was signed. He'd got Robert Nixon and Martha the Gypsy, the Ignatius Sibylla. Okay, if that's in Latin, which it looks like, it's Ignatius Sibylla. The old Otwell Binns, Nostradamus had signed, to mine own friend Aziraphale, with best wishes. Mother Shipton had spilled drink on his copy, and in a climate-controlled cabinet in one corner was the original scroll in the shaky handwriting of St. John, the Divine of Patmos, whose revelation had been the all-time bestseller. Aziraphale had found him a nice chap, but, if a bit too fond of odd mushrooms. What the collection did not have was a copy of the nice and accurate prophecies of Agnes Netter. And Aziraphale walked into the room holding it as a keen philatelist might hold a Mauritius blue that had just turned up on a postcard from his aunt. He'd never even seen a copy before, but he'd certainly heard about it. Everyone in the trade, which, considering it was a highly specialized trade, meant about a dozen people, had heard of it. Its existence was a sort of vacuum around which all sorts of strange stories had been orbiting for hundreds of years. Aziraphale realized he wasn't sure if you could orbit a vacuum, and didn't care. The nice and accurate prophecies made the Hitler diaries look like, well, a bunch of forgeries. His hands hardly shook at all as he laid it down on a bench. He pulled on a pair of surgical rubber gloves and opened it reverentially. Aziraphale was an angel, but he also worshipped books. The title said, The Nice and Accurate Prophecies of Agnes Nutter. In slightly smaller type, being a certain and precise history from the present day unto the ending of this world. In slightly larger type, containing therein many diverse wonders and precepts for the wise. In a different type, more complete than ever, yet before polished. It's in Old English. It's like Pvolifhed. I don't know. Whatever. Anyway, in smaller type, but in capitals, concerning the strange times ahead. In slightly desperate italics, and events of a wonderful nature. In larger type, once more, the reminiscent of Nostradamus at his best. Ursula Shipton. The prophecies were numbered, and there were more than 4,000 of them. Steady, steady, Aziraphale muttered to himself. He went into the little kitchenette and made himself some cocoa and took some deep breaths. Then he came back and read a prophecy at random. 40 minutes later, the cocoa was still untouched. The red-haired woman in the corner of the hotel bar was the most successful war correspondent in the world. She now had a passport in the name of Carmine Zwiegiber. I feel like that's wrong. Zwiegiber? Whatever. And she went where the wars were. Well, more or less. She actually went where the wars weren't. She'd already been where the wars were. She was not well known, except where it counted. Get half a dozen war correspondents together in an airport bar, and the conversation will, like a compass orienting north, swing around to Murchison of New York Times, to Van Horn of Newsweek, to Anforth of ITN News. The war correspondents. But when Murchison and Van Horn and Anforth ran into each other in a burnt-out tin shack in Beirut or Afghanistan or the Sudan, after they'd admired each other's scars and had downed a few, they would exchange odd anecdotes of Red Zegiber, I think that's how I say it, Zegiber, whatever, from the National World Weekly. That dumb rag, Murchison would say, doesn't goddamn know what it's goddamn got. Actually, the National World Weekly did know just what it had got. It had a war correspondent. It just didn't know why or what to do with one now that it had her. Alright, so I'm going to end it here. Sorry, my dyslexia was extra today. Tis what it is. I wasn't nearly as drunk. Somehow being drunk helps. Alright, so yes, I will see you guys at the next time. Namaste.